My name is David Carmichael, and for 20 years I was the invisible backbone of a company that pretended it didn't need me, until the day it proved me right. I'm 52 years old, I have gray at my temples, a reading glasses prescription I finally accepted, and a PhD in network infrastructure from Georgia Tech. I also have the deed to a $900 million server farm, which nobody else at Tech Vault Solutions seemed to remember. Not in board meetings, not in annual reports, not in the conversations that happened in the executive suite when people were planning the future without me. The irony, of course, is that none of that future was possible without the ground beneath that server farm. And the ground, legally speaking, belonged to me. Let me take you back to 1998. I was 30 years old, freshly graduated, and absolutely broke. The early internet boom was in full swing, and everyone with a half-decent idea was raising venture capital and buying server space like it was going out of style. I wasn't an entrepreneur, I was an engineer, but I was hungry, and I was good at what I did. Good enough that people called me when they needed things built. Good enough that I'd already turned down 3 job offers that year. Tech Vault Solutions didn't exist yet. What existed was 3 guys in a basement in Raleigh, North Carolina. Colin Reeves, Marcus Webb, and a guy named James Chen, and a vision to build the most reliable data infrastructure on the East Coast. They had the vision. They had the energy. They had the kind of optimism that only comes when you haven't yet realized how hard it actually is. What they didn't have was creditworthiness, collateral, or anyone willing to give them $1 million line of credit. What they didn't have was someone the banks would trust. That's where I came in. I was working at a regional ISP at the time, making good money, with no particular ambitions beyond a steady paycheck and the occasional weekend to myself. The job was stable. The people were decent. It was the kind of position that most people would have held on to without blinking. But there's something about stability that gets boring when you're 30 and still believe you have something to prove. Colin called me one Tuesday morning. We'd met at a conference, some infrastructure symposium in Atlanta, where we'd ended up next to each other at the hotel bar, and talked for 3 hours straight about redundancy protocols and fiber routing. He was the kind of guy who didn't take no for an answer, and he had a proposition that would change everything. "We need someone who understands infrastructure," he said over the phone, his voice carrying that particular kind of intensity you only hear from founders. "Someone the banks will trust, someone who'll sign the lease." The property was in Asheville, 300 acres of rolling North Carolina countryside, with underground fiber lines running straight through it and proximity to the regional power grid. It was perfect. It was also being leased by a firm that didn't care about tech startups with business plans and hope. They cared about credit scores and personal guarantees. They cared about someone putting their name on the line. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you have a credit history," Colin said. "Because you have a PhD and a respectable job. Because banks see you and they think, this is a serious person. And because I'm asking." I thought about it for maybe 2 seconds. Then I said yes. I signed the lease, not on behalf of Tech Vault Solutions, which didn't technically exist yet, on behalf of myself, David Carmichael, personally. My signature on a legal document that committed me to $240,000 per month for a 10-year initial term. That's $2.9 million, assuming nothing went wrong. At the time, I thought it was temporary. Colin and Marcus promised that as soon as the company got funded, as soon as they had proper credit, the lease would be transferred to the corporation. "This is just the opening move," Colin told me over beers the night I signed. "You're the sacrificial piece. But it's temporary. We'll get you out of this within 6 months, a year tops." Temporary lasted 20 years. The company grew faster than anyone expected. Within 3 years, we went from 3 guys in a dream to 100 employees. Within 5, we had offices in Charlotte, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. Within 10, we were listed on the NASDAQ. By year 15, Tech Vault Solutions was moving $9 billion in quarterly revenue, and our Asheville facility, the one I'd personally leased, was handling data for some of the biggest companies in America. Banks, insurance firms, healthcare networks, government agencies, financial institutions that would have been destroyed by a single hour of downtime. All of it flowing through the server farm I'd put my name on. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had ever updated that lease. I brought it up dozens of times over the years. I'd mention it to Colin in passing. Hey, we should probably get that transferred. He'd nod, say, yeah, absolutely, I'll have legal handle it. And then, nothing. Years would pass. Another CEO would come in, the company would go through a restructuring, and the lease would still be sitting in my filing cabinet, signed by me, dated 1998. I'd mention it to our VP of Legal once, around 2010. She promised to look into it. She changed jobs in 2012. The new VP of Legal promised the same thing. He got promoted. The cycle continued. At some point, I stopped asking. Not because I forgot about it. I never forgot about it. But because asking had stopped producing results. And after a while, the repetition of asking started to feel pointless. It was just something that was going to happen eventually. A piece of administrative cleanup that was on someone's to-do list, gathering dust. I wasn't trying to be clever. I wasn't playing long-term chess, waiting for the moment when I could leverage it. I was just an engineer doing his job, managing the infrastructure, hiring the right people, optimizing our systems, keeping everything running. I'd become the Senior Vice President of Infrastructure Operations. I had a team of 40 people reporting to me. I had a salary that would have seemed impossible to that 30-year-old version of me standing in a basement with Colin Reeves. I had 401k matching, stock options, and a corner office on the third floor of our Raleigh headquarters. Life was good. Not perfect, but solid. I was doing work I loved at a company I believed in, and I was paid very well for it. I had the kind of job where, on good days, I felt like I was building something real. And on bad days, and there were plenty of bad days, emergencies at 2 in the morning, infrastructure failures that required 18-hour troubleshooting sessions, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I did, somewhere in the back of my mind, and I just didn't want to acknowledge it. The first sign was the new CEO. Her name was Patricia Lundgren, and she arrived on a Monday in January with a mandate from the board. Optimize operations, eliminate redundancy, and prepare TechVault for aggressive expansion into the cloud computing market. In other words, cut costs, cut heads, and find a way to make more money without spending more money. She was 51. She had a Harvard MBA. She had been brought in from outside the company, which meant she didn't have the institutional memory or the relationships that come from being inside an organization for 2 decades. She saw spreadsheets. She saw headcounts. She saw my corner office and my team of 40 and saw an opportunity for cost reduction. I'd worked under 4 different CEOs before Patricia. None of them had ever questioned my value. I ran the backbone of the company. If I walked tomorrow, TechVault would lose millions before anyone could replace the institutional knowledge I held in my head. The procedures I documented, the relationships I'd built with the major clients, the troubleshooting expertise that couldn't be replicated by a junior engineer with an AWS certification and a startup mentality. Patricia didn't know that. Patricia didn't know anything about me except that I was 52 years old, expensive, and potentially vulnerable. Patricia didn't understand that some people in an organization are infrastructure. You can't see them until you need them, and then you realize that everything rests on them. The downsizing started in March. First, it was the San Francisco satellite office. Then it was the customer service team in Charlotte. Then it was strategic consolidation of the infrastructure division. My team went from 40 people to 35, then to 30. Mandatory 30% cuts across the board. No exceptions. No special considerations for the fact that infrastructure operations is not a function you can dramatically reduce without creating risk. I reorganized, I optimized, I made it work with less. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. I took complex problems and found elegant solutions. That's how you stay employed in a field like this. By June, Patricia had been brought in for the board meeting where she pitched the next phase. Digital transformation. New technology, new people, new approach. She had slides, she had metrics. She had a compelling vision of TechVault 2.0, a company that was lean and agile and unencumbered by the legacy infrastructure, people who'd been around since the beginning. She also had a plan to flatten the middle management structure, which meant consolidating several director-level roles into single positions, and bringing in younger talent who could be more flexible, more mobile, and, this was the unspoken part, more willing to work 80-hour weeks for salaries that wouldn't have been acceptable in the 90s. I heard it third hand, the way you hear things in a place where people are scared. Someone in legal told someone in finance, who told someone in HR, who didn't tell anyone but it got out anyway. The kind of whispered conversation that happens in the hallway outside the coffee station. They're going to want to move the infrastructure team under a younger director, someone more energetic, someone who understands modern tech stack, someone who isn't going to push back on the new vision. I wasn't worried. I was the expert. I was the guy who knew where every cable was buried, who understood the redundancy systems, who could troubleshoot a major outage in his sleep. They needed me. Not wanted me, needed me. There was a difference, and that difference was job security. I was wrong. On a Thursday morning in August, I got a calendar invite to Patricia's office. Just me, no agenda. The meeting was for 9 a.m., which meant it was going to happen before most of the office had even settled in with their first coffee. I remember standing in her anteroom for 5 minutes before her assistant told me to go in. 5 minutes is a long time to stand and wait. Long enough to run through scenarios. Long enough to think about what this could be about. Long enough to start feeling that crawling sensation in your stomach that tells you something is about to change. Patricia was at her desk, not looking at me, doing something with her computer. Her screen was angled away, so I couldn't see what she was working on. She didn't look up right away. When she did, she gestured to the chair across from her. Her expression was professionally neutral. The kind of expression someone practices in the mirror before they're about to fire someone. "Sit down," she said. Not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who'd already made a decision. Who'd rehearsed this conversation. Who'd probably gotten coaching from HR on the language to use. I sat. "David, I'm going to be direct. We're moving in a new direction with the infrastructure division. We're looking for someone younger, someone with a different background, someone who understands cloud-native architecture in a way that's going to help us position ourselves for the future." She paused. She had the script down. She'd done this before. Maybe many times before. "We're offering you a severance package," she continued. 12 months salary, benefits through the end of the year, and a small equity bonus as a thank you for 20 years of service. 12 months. That was the standard package. That's what you offer someone when you want them to leave without complaint. That's what you offer when you've calculated that the severance is cheaper than the risk of litigation. I didn't say anything at first. I was processing the words, but they didn't feel real. They felt like something happening to someone else. Like I was watching this scene in a movie, observing it rather than living it. "I'm being fired," I said finally. "You're being let go as part of a strategic restructuring," she said. "It's not personal, it's business. We need younger blood, fresh perspectives, people who are excited about the future instead of defending the past." Younger blood. That's the phrase she used. Not, "we need different experience," or "we need to try a new approach." Younger blood. Like I was some kind of stagnant resource that needed to be drained out and replaced. Like age wasn't something that happened to everyone, but rather a disease that needed to be purged. "And the rest of my team?" I asked. "We're consolidating some roles. We'll be bringing in a new director of infrastructure who will manage the core team, but we'll be significantly leaner." "Who?" I asked. "You'll meet him next week," she said. "His name is Derek Paulson. He's 34, just finished a tenure at Amazon Web Services, and he's very excited about the potential here." Derek Paulson, 34 years old, just got poached from AWS. They were replacing me with someone young enough to be my son. Someone with cloud experience, but probably no idea how to manage a physical infrastructure footprint or handle a crisis situation that didn't have a documented solution on AWS forums. Someone who'd never had to decide between redundancy and cost in a way that kept systems stable through a recession. I thought about my team, the people I'd hired, the engineers I'd mentored. Some of them had gone on to lead infrastructure departments at other companies. Some of them were probably going to get fired as part of Derek's consolidation. All of that institutional knowledge, all of those relationships, all of those years of building something together, about to be scattered. "Is there any room for discussion?" I asked. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, and she sounded like she might actually mean it. "The decision's been made. You'll get the formal paperwork from HR within the hour. You can go back to your office, collect your things, and HR will escort you out. We'd appreciate it if you didn't discuss this with anyone else on your team until they hear the news from the new director." Translation: don't cause a scene. Don't try to rally support. Don't tell your team what's really happening until we've already spun the narrative. I got up. I didn't say anything else. What was there to say? Walking back to my office, I wasn't angry. That came later. In that moment, I was numb. I'd spent 20 years building this company. I'd stayed late, come in on weekends, took calls at 3 in the morning during infrastructure emergencies. I'd built redundancy systems that had prevented millions of dollars in data loss. I'd mentored people who were now senior leaders across the industry. I'd turned the Asheville facility into one of the most reliable server farms in North America. And I'd done it all while maintaining an institutional knowledge that nobody else had bothered to document, because I'd always assumed there would be time. There's always time, until there isn't. And they didn't need me anymore because some Harvard MBA decided I was too old. I sat at my desk for an hour after getting the formal paperwork from HR. An hour in that corner office, looking at the diplomas on the wall, the PhD from Georgia Tech, the certifications, all of it. The photos of my team at various company events, the award plaques from industry conferences. All of these things that you accumulate over 20 years, assuming they mean something, assuming they're evidence of value. Then I opened my filing cabinet and took out a manila folder. Inside was the original lease from 1998, signed by me, stamped by the property company, binding as the day it was created. I'd kept it through 4 CEOs, through mergers and restructurings and strategic pivots, through the IPO and the expansion into new markets. I'd kept it because I had a feeling that someday it might matter. I didn't know it would matter like this. And that's when something shifted inside me. Not immediately. It wasn't a thunderbolt of realization. It was more like a slow click, like a lock turning in a door that had been closed for 20 years. Like a piece of code finally executing after years of sitting dormant. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt something else, something quieter, something like understanding, something that felt almost like professional satisfaction. The satisfaction of recognizing a system vulnerability and understanding exactly how to leverage it. I didn't look at that lease as I was being escorted out of the building. I'd put it back in my desk drawer, slid it into my laptop bag, and walked past my team without making eye contact. Derek Paulson was probably already sitting in someone's conference room getting his orientation briefing. My team would find out what was happening soon enough, probably when Derek made some announcement about the restructuring. They'd be confused at first, then they'd be worried about their own jobs, then they'd move on. That's how it works. You build something and then you leave, and eventually everyone forgets that you were the one who built it. The facility I'd left behind was a 600,000 square foot installation on 150 acres of the Asheville property. It housed over 40,000 physical servers, representing roughly $2 billion in hardware and equipment, and it generated approximately $900 million in annual revenue for TechVault Solutions. It was the crown jewel. The crown jewel that technically belonged to the company, but sat on land that legally belonged to David Carmichael. Land that I'd personally committed to lease for 10 years back in 1998, and which had never been formally transferred despite 2 decades of operation. Nobody had noticed this detail except me, and now that I'd been fired, it was starting to become interesting. I didn't call a lawyer that Friday. I didn't do anything dramatic or reactive. Instead, I went home to my house in Chapel Hill, a 4-bedroom colonial I'd paid off 8 years ago, and I read the lease front to back. Every word, every clause, every contingency. I made notes. I looked up the property management company. I looked up North Carolina contract law. I looked up the history of TechVault's corporate restructurings. The lease was dated January 15, 1998. It was for a 10-year initial term, with automatic renewal in 5-year increments, as long as rent was paid on time. Rent on that initial lease was $240,000 per month, which sounds like nothing compared to what the facility generates now, but was a fortune to 3 guys in a basement back then. The lease required personal guarantee from the lessee, me, and it specifically stated that this lease shall remain in the name of the individual whose signature appears hereon, unless formally transferred through written amendment, duly executed and recorded with the Property Management Company and the North Carolina Department of Revenue. No amendment had ever been filed. No transfer had ever been recorded. When TechVault went public in 2008, they'd issued shares, restructured the corporate entity, brought in professional boards and proper governance. And somewhere in that shuffle, they forgot about the lease. Or maybe they just assumed it was handled. Corporate structures are complicated. People change departments, retire, lose files. It's easy to assume someone else is managing something when nobody specifically says, "Hey, this thing is being handled by me." Saturday morning, I called my brother-in-law. His name is Robert Hernandez. He's a real estate attorney in Charlotte, and he'd been my friend long before he was my brother-in-law. I'd introduced him to my sister at a dinner party in 2001. I didn't want to spook him, so I framed it casually. "Hey, hypothetical question," I said. "If you personally signed a commercial lease on behalf of a startup, and the startup later incorporated and went public, but nobody ever formally transferred that lease to the new entity, whose name would the lease actually be in?" There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you someone has just realized this probably isn't hypothetical. "The person who signed it," Robert said. "Why?" "Just curious," I said. "What would happen if the company tried to claim they owned the lease?" "They wouldn't be able to," he said. "A lease is a contract. Contracts are binding on the parties who signed them. If the company wanted to claim an interest in that lease, they'd need a formal assignment of rights, filed and recorded. What if the company had been operating under the assumption that they owned it? What if they'd been using the property for years?" "Doesn't matter," Robert said. "Assumption isn't transfer. Use isn't ownership. If the lease is in your name, it's your lease, period." I could hear him shifting his tone, recognizing that this wasn't hypothetical anymore. "David, what's going on?" I told him. I laid out the entire situation, the lease, the facility, the firing, all of it. I didn't expect him to be excited. I expected him to tell me I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting to getting fired, that I should take the severance and move on with my life. That's what a sensible person would have expected. Instead, he said, "I need to see this lease." I scanned it that afternoon and sent it to him. He called me back at 6 p.m. "This is real," he said. "I mean, I believe you, I trust you. But David, this is legitimately, completely real. You own the ground lease on a $900 million server farm." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means that at any point you could terminate that lease," he said slowly. "Or you could demand that TechVault agree to whatever terms you set for a formal transfer. Or, and I say this carefully because I need you to understand the implications, you could serve an eviction notice on the property. 300 acres, 40,000 servers, all of it sitting on land you legally control." I let that sink in, the weight of it, the implications, not just for TechVault but for me, for what this meant, for what I could do with it. "I don't want to do that," I said. "I know you don't," he said. "But they don't know you don't, and that's worth something." Sunday, I didn't hear from TechVault. Monday wasn't going to be any different. My severance was processed, my health insurance would continue through the end of the year, my 401k was vested. Legally and financially I was clean. I was just unemployed. I spent Monday morning in my home office, laptop open, coffee growing cold, just thinking about what I'd built, about the people I'd worked with, about Patricia Lundgren sitting in her office, probably already getting briefings from Derek Paulson about the infrastructure division, about whether she was sleeping well, or whether she had any idea what she'd just done. Derek would ask questions. He'd dig into systems I'd built, documentation I'd written, procedures I'd established, and he'd probably find that things were actually running quite smoothly, thank you very much, because I'd built them to run smoothly. That's the thing about good infrastructure. It's invisible. It's only visible when it fails. By Monday afternoon, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to sue. I wasn't going to make a public spectacle. I wasn't going to burn bridges or destroy the company. But I was going to make sure that TechVault understood, at a visceral level, that they couldn't just discard people like me, that institutional knowledge had actual market value, that an ageist termination had concrete consequences. I called Robert on Monday night. "I want to know what happens if I don't renew the lease," I said. "You have leverage now," he said. "That's what this is really about, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "Tell me what happens." "The lease renews automatically unless you explicitly notify the property management company in writing 30 days before the renewal date," Robert explained. "When's your next renewal date?" I pulled up the lease. "September 15th. That's about 2 weeks away." "So you have 2 weeks to notify them," Robert said. "But David, before you do anything, understand what you're actually contemplating. If you don't renew, the lease terminates. TechVault would have 30 days to vacate. You'd be asking them to move $900 million in equipment within 30 days, which is basically impossible. They'd be liable for all the contracts they can't fulfill, all the data they can't migrate, all the clients they'd have to notify. This isn't a threat to take lightly." "How much liability are we talking?" I asked. "Hundreds of millions," Robert said. "Maybe $1 billion, depending on how you calculate it. Maybe more. There are contracts in place, probably. Penalties for downtime, penalties for data loss, costs associated with maintaining operations elsewhere. This could be catastrophic. And that's if I just don't renew." "That's if you don't renew," Robert confirmed. "Now, if you want to make a specific demand, if you want to force them to agree to a formal transfer with specific terms, or if you want settlement compensation, you'd need to get ahead of the renewal date. You'd need to contact TechVault, explain the situation, and make your position clear." I thanked him and hung up. All evening Tuesday, I sat with that information. I wasn't going to destroy the company. That wasn't the point. Destruction didn't interest me. But I was going to make sure they understood what they'd done, and that there were consequences to treating people like they were disposable. Wednesday morning, I drafted a letter. Not threatening, just factual. I explained the situation in plain language. The lease was in my name. No transfer had ever been formally executed. The renewal date was approaching, and I was seeking a formal meeting with TechVault's board and legal counsel to discuss the matter and determine a path forward. I made 2 copies. I signed them both. Then I called a courier service and had them hand-delivered to TechVault's headquarters. The letter arrived Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, I had 3 calls from people at TechVault. The first was from someone in legal. She was professional, clearly shaken, asking if I'd be willing to discuss this before the renewal date. Her voice had that particular tension of someone who just realized something terrible had occurred on her watch. The second was from Colin Reeves, the original founder, now executive chairman. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not the confident, visionary tone I remembered, but strained, controlled anger barely concealed under professional courtesy. "David, I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish here. We were fair with you. We're being fair with you. The severance is generous." "This isn't about the severance," I said. "Then what is it about?" he asked. "It's about the fact that you let Patricia Lundgren fire me for being too old, and neither you nor anyone else in that building bothered to check whether I'd actually transferred the ground lease," I said. "You gambled that I wouldn't remember it existed. You lost." There was silence on the line. The kind of silence that tells you someone is recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the situation. The moment when the entire ground shifts beneath their feet. "I'm not trying to destroy the company," I continued. "But I'm also not going to pretend this doesn't matter. I spent 20 years building this, and it took Patricia Lundgren 45 minutes to discard me because someone told her younger blood was more valuable." "What do you want?" Colin asked finally. "I want to meet with the board and legal counsel," I said. "I want to discuss a formal transfer of the lease, with terms that reflect the situation accurately. And I want an apology from Patricia Lundgren." "That last one's not going to happen," Colin said. "Then we'll find out what your renewal date costs," I said. Colin hung up. The Friday call came from TechVault's chief legal officer, a woman named Sandra Park. She was sharp, direct, and visibly frustrated even through the phone. "Your threat is noted," she said. But you should understand that we have remedies available. We could argue unjust enrichment. We could challenge the validity of your claim. You could do a lot of things, I said, all of which would take months, possibly years. Meanwhile, your renewal date is in 9 days. There was a long pause. When can you meet? She asked. I told her Tuesday. I told her to bring the board, bring legal counsel, bring whoever needed to be there. I told her I'd be meeting with my attorney, Robert Hernandez, and that any agreement needed to be formally executed with recorded amendments within 2 weeks. She agreed. That Friday evening, I actually smiled for the first time since the firing. Not a cruel smile, not a victory lap, just a quiet recognition that sometimes the game has more layers than people expect, and sometimes patience is the most dangerous weapon of all. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait and listen, and understand that the moment you stop being useful, you become dangerous. I spent the weekend with Robert planning. We discussed terms, a formal transfer of the lease to TechVault Solutions in exchange for additional severance, vesting acceleration on my stock options, and a settlement amount that would reflect the value of what I was transferring. We discussed what would happen if they refused, what the next moves would be, how far we'd need to push. We discussed scenarios where they tried to call the bluff, and what would happen if we actually had to follow through. Then you don't renew, Robert said simply, and we enjoy watching them scramble. I don't want to destroy them, I said. You won't, he said. They'll pay whatever you ask, because the alternative is catastrophic. He was right. Monday morning, I got another call from Sandra Park. She was businesslike, almost cold. We've reviewed the situation, she said. We understand your position. We'd like to discuss settlement parameters before the board meeting. I'm listening, I said. Immediate conversion of your severance from 12 months to 24 months. Full acceleration of all vested stock options, and a one-time settlement payment of $3 million in exchange for immediate formal transfer of the lease and a non-disparagement agreement. $3 million. That was a number that made my head spin a little. That was more money than I'd made in my entire career at TechVault, offered in a single lump sum. That was the company's opening offer in a negotiation they'd already lost. I'll discuss it with my attorney, I said, and I want to understand why Patricia isn't on this call. Patricia has been placed on administrative leave, Sandra said, as of this morning. I didn't feel vindication, but I felt something. Not quite satisfaction, but acknowledgement. The company understood. They'd understood the moment they realized what I actually held in my hands. And they understood that firing someone for their age, while that person held the legal deed to your most valuable asset, was a particularly expensive mistake. A mistake that would cost them millions. Tuesday, I said. Board meeting. Formal terms on the table. Tuesday, she agreed. I hung up and called Robert. They're scared, I said. Of course they are, he said. Let's make sure they stay scared long enough to sign a good agreement. The boardroom at TechVault Solutions was on the 42nd floor of the Raleigh office tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view was spectacular, the kind of view that looks like success. I'd been in that room before, during quarterly earnings presentations and strategic planning sessions, but I'd never walked in as the person holding all the cards. Robert was beside me, carrying a leather portfolio with copies of the lease, our counterproposal, and documentation of the renewal date. He was wearing a gray suit that fit him perfectly. He looked like someone who knew what he was doing. Colin Reeves was there. So were 7 board members I recognized by face, if not always by name. Sandra Park, the chief legal officer, sat at the far end of the table with her legal team. 3 attorneys in dark suits, laptops open, ready to document everything. And Patricia Lundgren wasn't there, which was its own kind of statement. There was one empty chair. They'd left it for me. The meeting started with Colin clearing his throat and attempting to set the tone as the visionary founder trying to find common ground with a valued former employee. David, I want to emphasize that this company has tremendous respect for the work you've done over the past 20 years, he began. I let him finish before I interrupted. I appreciate that, I said. But let's not pretend this is about respect. This is about the fact that you made a mistake in 1998 when you asked me to sign a personal lease. And you made a bigger mistake last month when you fired me without first verifying that I'd actually transferred that lease to the corporation. You didn't. I didn't. And now we're here. One of the board members, a woman whose name I thought was Catherine, leaned forward. "We understand the situation," she said. "Sandra has prepared a proposal." "I know about the proposal," I said. $3 million, 24 months severance, stock acceleration. It's more generous than I expected. Sandra visibly relaxed, thinking we were heading toward agreement. That was the moment I waited for, the moment when they thought they'd won. "But it's not enough," I continued. The room went quiet. "Not enough?" Colin asked, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "Not enough," I repeated. "You paid me to build something that generates $900 million in annual revenue. You're offering me $3 million to give you legal title to the land it sits on. That's a 0.03% of the annual value. I need $50 million. That's unreasonable," one of the other board members said immediately. "It's market rate," I said. "You want to know what it would cost to relocate a facility that size? What it would cost to break $900 million worth of contracts and renegotiate them with new infrastructure? What it would cost to deal with the downtime, the client relationships damaged beyond repair? $50 million is a bargain, and you know it." Sandra was looking at her notes, calculating. Her lips were moving silently, counting zeros. I could see her working through the math. $1 billion in potential liability, maybe more, versus $50 million in settlement. It was simple arithmetic. "You're asking for $50 million, Colin said slowly, "for a lease you signed 20 years ago that you never intended to retain." "I'm asking for $50 million, I said, "for 2 decades of work, loyalty, and institutional knowledge that your new CEO decided wasn't worth keeping around. I'm asking for compensation that reflects the value of what I built and what you're taking from me. And I'm asking for it because you violated an implicit contract between us when you terminated me for my age." Robert spoke for the first time. "We're also requesting formal documentation that the termination was based on economic restructuring, not discriminatory reasons. My client is willing to sign a non-disparagement agreement, but he needs documentation from the company clarifying that the termination was not age-based." That's when I watched the entire board shift. Because that's when they realized that I wasn't just asking for money. I was asking for cover from an ageism lawsuit that could have made $50 million look like a rounding error. Sandra stood up. "I need to speak with the board privately," she said. "Of course," I said. Robert and I were escorted into an anteroom with coffee and silence. 20 minutes later, Sandra came back. $50 million is not on the table," she said. "But we're prepared to offer $30 million with immediate execution of all terms and documentation of the termination as a result of economic restructuring due to strategic repositioning of the infrastructure division." $30 million. I looked at Robert. He nodded slightly. We'd discussed going lower than 50. We'd discussed what the floor was. 30 million was above that floor. It was enough. 30 million, I said, along with the stock acceleration and extended severance. And one more condition. I want the official termination memo to include a statement that my separation was based on strategic realignment, and that my contributions to the company's infrastructure and operational resilience are recognized as significant. Sandra didn't even blink. "Done," she said. "We'll have the documents prepared within 2 hours. Formal execution can happen this evening." That evening, in that same boardroom, I signed the papers. Sandra signed. Colin signed. The board chair signed. And just like that, the ground lease, the document I'd been holding in my filing cabinet for 20 years, the contract that nobody else remembered existed, the single piece of paper that held the entire operation hostage, was formally transferred to TechVault Solutions. $30 million. Stock acceleration that was worth another $4 million. 24 months severance on top of my existing severance. A formal memo of understanding that documented my separation as economic restructuring, not age-based termination. The company issued a press release the next morning. TechVault Solutions has reached an amicable agreement with David Carmichael regarding his separation from the company. with appreciation for his 2 decades of service in building our infrastructure operations. They didn't mention the lease. They didn't mention the threatened leverage. They certainly didn't mention the fact that they'd been one signature away from losing their most valuable asset. I found out that Patricia Lundgren was terminated for cause the same day, with no severance. Not because of what she'd done to me, but because the board decided that the risk of an age discrimination lawsuit was high enough that they needed to remove her from the equation. She was in her 50s too, as it turned out. Younger blood apparently has its limits. What nobody outside the company knew was that they'd also changed all their policies around lease management and corporate asset documentation. Every facility, every contract, every critical agreement was now reviewed quarterly by a dedicated compliance team to ensure that no other person, no other David Carmichael, could ever hold a company's most valuable asset in their personal name. Derek Paulson stayed on as director of infrastructure. He was competent enough, though I heard from friends still at the company that he was still learning the actual operational complexity of running the facility I'd left behind. He'd made some changes, optimized some things, brought in new people with fresh perspectives. Most of them didn't work as well as what was there before, but that's not something you can say out loud in a company culture that's trying to prove something. As for me, I took the $30 million and did what I'd planned to do for about 5 years. I stepped back. I hired a financial advisor. I set up trusts for my nieces and nephews. I paid off my sister's house. I bought a lake property in upstate New York where I spent most of 2024 doing nothing but fishing and reading, watching the seasons change, thinking about infrastructure in a way that didn't involve spreadsheets or uptime metrics. I thought about all the years I'd spent optimizing systems, and I decided to optimize my life instead, toward rest, toward presence, toward the kind of quiet that only comes when you stop building and start being. I consulted for a few smaller infrastructure companies on a part-time basis, but mostly I just lived. I'd spent 20 years building something that didn't appreciate me until I threatened to take it away. I wasn't going to spend the next 20 years building anything else. The story got around eventually, the way these stories do in industries where everyone knows everyone. People called it different things. Some called it a power play. Some called it corruption. Some called it justice. But the people who really understood, the people who'd spent years in corporate environments where loyalty was a one-way street and age was treated like a liability, they understood what it really was. It was recognition. It was the moment when the system that had been taking from me had to acknowledge what it owed, because the power dynamic suddenly shifted. I don't think about it as vindication exactly. Vindication implies that I was wronged and then corrected. That's too neat. What happened was more complicated. The company made a choice based on incomplete information. They didn't know that I'd been holding the ground lease in my personal name. Patricia Lundgren didn't know. Sandra Park probably didn't know until she received my letter. Colin Reeves probably didn't know. He'd been managing the company through growth and public offerings and strategic shifts, and somewhere in all that complexity, one piece of paper got lost. And when that paper became relevant again, the entire equation changed. I think about the young people in that company sometimes. Derek Paulson and his team of bright 30-somethings, optimized and energized and ready to take the company into the cloud-native future. I hope they're happy there. I hope the infrastructure they run is as reliable as the systems I left behind. And I hope that somewhere along the way, they learn the real lesson, that loyalty and institutional knowledge have actual market value, and that treating people like they're disposable has consequences. The broader lesson is darker. It's that institutional power is fragile. It looks unshakable until you realize that it's built on foundations that might be held by a single person's contract. TechVault Solutions generated $900 million in annual revenue, but it had placed its crown jewel on land that was technically owned by a 52-year-old man who worked in infrastructure operations. That was the vulnerability. That was the single point of failure that nobody had noticed. That's not a story about one man's revenge. That's a story about how even the largest systems can be held hostage by the smallest details, and how the people who understand those details, the quiet engineers, the infrastructure people, the institutional memory keepers, are never as disposable as they're treated. 20 years I spent building that company. In the end, it only took the threat of 2 weeks without that foundation to make them understand what I was worth. That's not satisfaction exactly, but it is its own kind of truth.